It was the kind of silence that doesn't just fall, it crashes. One moment, the courtroom was chaos. Voices clashing, papers shuffling, the scrape of chairs against tile. The next, nothing. Not because they chose to be quiet, but because a single bang demanded it. Bang! The sound cracked through the air, ricocheting off oak-paneled walls, sharp as a gunshot. The scent of polished wood mixed with the cold breath from the ancient vents above. And there she sat, Judge Amara Lewis. Black robe, straight-backed, hands steady, face carved in stone. A moment ago, you wouldn't have guessed she was the one in charge. The attorneys, both white, both wearing $1,000 suits, had been speaking over her, past her, around her, as if the bench she sat on was invisible, as if she was invisible. Leading the charge was Daniel Kerrigan, an old money defense attorney with a booming voice and the swagger of someone who's never been told no. He leaned on the defense table like he owned it, dictating the pace, the tone, even the mood of the room. His co-counsel followed his lead, eyes never once rising to acknowledge the judge who actually held the gavel. It wasn't just arrogance. It wasn't just disrespect. It was a message, one that dripped with something older, uglier, and far more deliberate. And Amara, she let it happen. She let their words trample the air between them. She let the arrogance breed, fester, until it became so thick you could feel it pressing on your skin. Then came the gavel, not as an interruption, not as a plea for order, but as a shot across the bow. The jurors froze mid-scribble, pens hovering above yellow pads. The bailiff straightened like a soldier to a command. Kerrigan's last word died halfway out of his mouth, hanging awkwardly in the charged stillness. Amara didn't lean forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her eyes locked on Kerrigan's like the cold gaze of someone who's already measured your coffin. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but it cut sharper than any shout could. Mr. Kerrigan, you seem to be under the impression this is your courtroom. Allow me to correct you. No one moved. The reporters in the gallery stopped writing. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick more slowly. Kerrigan's lips twitched, halfway between a smirk and the dawning realization that something had shifted beneath his feet. You could feel it, even from the back row. The balance of power, the one everyone thought they understood, had tilted. Judge Lewis didn't waste her gavel on noise. She used it as a warning. And what no one in that room knew, not yet, was that Daniel Kerrigan had just taken his first step into a trap she had no intention of springing, until the moment it would destroy him completely. To understand what happened in that courtroom, we have to go back. Because moments like that, where silence feels heavier than a shout, they don't happen by accident. They're the result of history. Two histories, colliding. On one side, Judge Amara Lewis, the kind of judge whose name carried weight, not because she demanded respect, but because she earned it. Born in Baltimore, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a hospital, her earliest memories weren't of playgrounds or summer vacations, but of sitting quietly in the corner of a waiting room, doing homework, while her mother tended to patients. She learned early that composure wasn't an act, it was armor. By 16, she was the top of her class. By 25, the youngest to graduate from her law school with honors. By 38, she wore the robe. Amara didn't just know the law, she embodied it. She could quote precedent in her sleep, but more importantly, she understood the weight of justice. And in a city like this, justice didn't come easy. Picture her chambers, dark cherrywood shelves lined with law books, their spines worn soft, framed degrees on the wall, and a single faded photograph of her mother in scrubs, smiling despite exhaustion. Everything in its place, a desk cleared at the end of each day, not out of habit, but as a declaration of control. Control she would need, because on the other side stood Daniel Kerrigan. The Kerrigan name was old money, a dynasty. His grandfather, Attorney General. His father, a litigator, whose victories were as much about influence as skill. Daniel grew up knowing two things. 1. The law was a game. 2. People like him always won. By the time he stepped into a courtroom, he carried the kind of confidence most men spend decades faking. Custom suits from Manhattan, a watch worth more than a clerk's yearly salary. Every detail whispered, untouchable. In court, he leaned back just far enough to look relaxed. Forward, just enough to remind you he was engaged. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His name did the work, and beneath the charm, a sharper edge, one that cut deepest when aimed at people who didn't fit his idea of worthy. Kerrigan wasn't a man who used slurs in public. He didn't need to. His racism was quieter, more precise. A pause before saying a black colleague's name. The forgetting to make eye contact. The whispered joke, just loud enough for the right ears. In his mind, a black woman in authority wasn't just unusual. It was inconvenient. One he could sidestep, undermine, and eventually remove. The first time they met was over a small civil case. Nothing headline-worthy. But the friction was immediate. He addressed her not as Your Honor, but Judge Lewis, with just enough emphasis to make it sound lesser. Her eyes flickered, the smallest acknowledgement, but she moved on, not because it didn't matter, but because the best traps aren't sprung early. Over the years, their paths crossed again, sometimes on opposite sides of the courtroom, sometimes with him defending clients whose arrogance mirrored his own. Each time, his disrespect grew bolder. One afternoon, during a pre-trial conference, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded behind his head. "You know, Judge," he said, dripping false courtesy, "these procedural delays, they're not helping your docket's reputation." She didn't look up, just made a note, and kept going. Because she understood, the best way to win against a man like Kerrigan was to let him believe he was winning. Outside court, their worlds couldn't have been more different. Kerrigan, country club cocktail parties, handshakes with men who owned half the city, weekends in vineyards, where the wine cost more than rent. Amara, quiet dinners with her mother, late-night case reviews, morning runs through the park before the city woke. Two people shaped by different rules, two people destined to collide. And then came the case, the one that would drag them into a fight neither could walk away from. For Kerrigan, another notch on his belt, and maybe the chance to put Judge Lewis in her place. For Amara, something far bigger. Because some battles aren't about the case in front of you. They're about every slight, every whisper, every look that says you don't belong here. This time, she wasn't going to just hold the line. She was going to end it. But to end it, she'd have to let him think the game was his. The last image before returning to that fateful day in court. Amara, in her chambers, the soft glow of a desk lamp washing her face in gold. She closes a file, sets it aside, and looks toward the door. A faint smile, the kind that says, "I know exactly how this ends." The case that brought them back into the same courtroom wasn't small. It was a spectacle, a high-profile trial, corporate fraud, on a scale that bled millions from pension funds and left hundreds of families hanging by a thread. The kind of case that filled the press gallery, that had reporters fighting for a seat, that could make or break careers. And Daniel Kerrigan, he was defending the accused, a pharmaceutical CEO with deep pockets and deeper connections, a man whose smile could sell you medicine you didn't need, and whose greed could kill without leaving fingerprints. From the first day of the trial, the atmosphere was heavy. Camera crews clustered outside the courthouse. Protesters waved signs on the steps, some demanding justice, others defending job creators. Inside, you could feel the hum of something combustible. Judge Amara Lewis took her seat, black robe crisp, hair perfectly pulled back. Her docket was stacked, her rulings ready. Everything about her posture said order, control, authority. Kerrigan came in late, not technically late, just late enough that she noticed. His arrival was an event, the double doors swinging wide, his cologne announcing him before his words did. He offered a half smile to the jury and didn't look at her. The first morning, it began with small interruptions. She'd finish a sentence, and he'd start speaking before her words had even settled. When she overruled his objection, he'd clarify the point directly to the jury, as though her ruling were an inconvenience he could simply sidestep. By day 3, the interruptions weren't occasional. They were constant. "Mr. Kerrigan, you may proceed." "Well, Your Honor, before I do, the jury needs to understand that." Each time, he layered his voice just over hers. Not loud, but deliberate. The verbal equivalent of stepping in front of someone while they're walking. It didn't stop at words. When she addressed him directly, his eyes would drift to his notes, to his watch, to the ceiling, anywhere but her. When she ruled against him, his jaw would flex, his lips pressing into a line just shy of open defiance. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. The cameras noticed. The cameras noticed. But Kerrigan was careful. He couched every act of disrespect in the language of advocacy. He was zealous for his client. He was protecting the integrity of the process. And if anyone dared suggest his behavior was inappropriate, he had a ready smile and a line about how courtrooms are passionate places. Off the record, there was no smile. During a recess, in the hallway outside the judge's chambers, he leaned against the wall, chatting with 2 colleagues. His voice was lower now, not for secrecy, but for intimacy. "You put someone like her on the bench," he said, shaking his head, "and suddenly it's all about feelings, not facts." The chuckle that followed was warm enough to sound harmless, unless you caught the way his eyes narrowed. A reporter passing by caught enough of it to know. The clerk who overheard stiffened. The whispers began. They didn't call it what it was, not out loud, but it was clear. The disrespect in court wasn't just ego. It was targeted, specific, calculated. Amara didn't respond. Not publicly. Not yet. Inside, though, something shifted. Her patience wasn't infinite. It was strategic. And Kerrigan had just crossed a line he didn't even see. The next morning, she arrived before anyone else. The courtroom was empty, except for the bailiff. She placed her notes in precise stacks, smoothed the sleeves of her robe, and sat in silence for a moment. Not to calm herself, but to sharpen her focus. Because this wasn't about a man being rude in her courtroom. This was about a man who thought her presence there was an accident, a mistake, one he could correct. When court convened, Kerrigan was ready to push again. He questioned the state's witness with a smile so confident it bordered on smug. He paced the floor in front of the jury, like a man performing on stage. And when Amara sustained an objection from the prosecution, he chuckled under his breath, loud enough for the jury to hear. Her eyes didn't leave him. She didn't warn him. She didn't raise her voice. But the silence that followed was a promise. By midweek, the trial wasn't just about corporate fraud anymore. It was about dominance. And in the unspoken contest between judge and defense counsel, Kerrigan thought he was winning. Because he didn't see the way she was watching him. He didn't notice that her rulings, while fair, were starting to tighten the walls around him. He didn't realize that every interruption, every glance away, every smirk, was going on a ledger in her mind. That ledger would matter. On the record, the trial moved forward. Off the record, in the quiet corridors and whispered corners, the conversation was changing. Court staff traded looks. Reporters began to frame their questions more carefully. And those who had worked with Judge Lewis before knew the signs. She wasn't ignoring Kerrigan. She was giving him rope. The thing about men like Daniel Kerrigan is that they don't retreat. When they meet resistance, they double down. By the second week of the trial, the interruptions weren't just about timing. They were about defiance. He stopped standing when addressing the bench, unless ordered to. He spoke to the prosecution, as if Judge Lewis wasn't even in the room. And when she gave instructions to the jury, he'd smirk, lean back,
and scribble in his notes, like a bored schoolboy. Every small act chipped away at the picture of authority she projected. That was the point. He ignored deadlines for filing motions, knowing she'd have to address it on record. He accidentally submitted incomplete exhibits, forcing delays, and each time, his tone was polite, apologetic, dripping with the false charm of someone who knows you can't quite prove intent. Outside the courtroom, the game was dirtier. A column appeared in the local paper, unsigned, questioning whether Judge Lewis was over her head handling a trial of this magnitude. A legal podcast ran a segment titled, "When Judges Lose the Room." Even a late-night radio host joked about the invisible judge presiding over the city's biggest case. None of it mentioned race outright, but it didn't have to. The subtext was there, and it was ugly. Kerrigan's network made sure the whispers carried. A retired judge, an old friend of his father's, gave an interview about the importance of experience. A pointed remark given Amara's relatively young age for the bench. A former client of Kerrigan's tweeted about judges who can't keep control of their courtrooms. The message was clear. Her authority was slipping. Inside the courtroom, the jurors were watching. Some of them laughed quietly at his asides. Some looked to him instead of her. When seeking clarity, confidence is contagious, and Kerrigan knew it. For Amara, the walls began to close in. The pressure was constant. Every ruling she made was picked apart in the press. Every expression she wore was captured, screenshotted, and analyzed online. Her chambers felt smaller each night, the air heavier, and still, she gave him nothing. No flashes of anger, no raised voice, no loss of composure he could point to and say, "See, unfit." She understood something Kerrigan never would. Revenge isn't served in moments of fury. It's crafted in silence. But silence doesn't mean inaction. She started watching him more closely. Every time he bent a rule, she made note of the exact time and date. Every time he spoke over her, she recorded the transcript entry herself before her clerk could file it. The court reporter noticed. The bailiff noticed. And slowly, a handful of reporters in the gallery noticed too. They saw the pattern emerging, the deliberate disrespect, the constant undermining, and began to wonder how long it could go on. One afternoon, it reached a boiling point. The prosecution had called a key witness, a mid-level accountant from the defendant's company. Before she could take the stand, Kerrigan approached the bench, not respectfully, not even in a whisper. "Your Honor," he said, his voice loud enough for the jury to hear, "I'd like to note for the record that this witness has already been coached. This testimony is tainted." It was a statement, not a question, and it was an accusation, one that implied she'd allowed something improper. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The witness froze halfway to the stand. The prosecution erupted in objection. Judge Lewis held up a hand. The room fell still. "Mr. Kerrigan," she said, evenly, "approach the bench." Now, he took his time, straightened his tie, smiled faintly as he strolled forward. When he reached her, she leaned in just enough for only the attorneys to hear. "If you attempt to undermine the integrity of this court in front of the jury again," she said, her voice low and cold, "you will find yourself in contempt before you finish your sentence. Do I make myself clear?" Kerrigan's smile didn't falter. "Crystal, Your Honor." He returned to his table, but the damage was done. The jurors had seen the moment, and to them, it looked like a skirmish he'd survived unscathed. That night, another blog post appeared, praising his fearless defense against judicial overreach. The next morning, a juror was spotted reading it on their phone before proceedings began. The storm was growing, and to anyone watching from the outside, it looked like Judge Lewis was losing ground. But inside, she was still building. She began adjusting her rulings subtly, forcing Kerrigan into tighter procedural corners. She allowed some of his motions to pass, knowing they would set him up for contradictions later. She denied others on technicalities so specific he'd have to waste valuable time correcting them. She didn't push back publicly yet, because she was saving the push for when it would matter most. In the evenings, she met quietly with her clerk, going over case law and old disciplinary records, not just for the trial at hand, but for the man trying to break her. Every insult, every breach of decorum, every whisper outside those walls was another weight on the scale she intended to tip all at once. Kerrigan kept pressing oblivious. He saw her restraint as weakness. He believed the headlines. He thought the jury's half-smiles were proof he'd already won. But men like Kerrigan never see it coming. Not until the floor disappears beneath them. And in Judge Amara Lewis's mind, that moment was coming. Soon. The shift didn't come in the courtroom. It came late on a Thursday night, long after the day's proceedings had ended, when the halls of the courthouse were empty, and the only sound in Judge Lewis's chambers was the slow tick of the wall clock. She'd been reviewing motions for an entirely different case, a pro bono matter she'd agreed to oversee. It was supposed to be straightforward, until one name buried in a stack of discovery files made her pause. A witness list, an attorney of record, a date from years back. Daniel Kerrigan. She frowned, not because he was everywhere. He was, but because this case, from a decade ago, was flagged with a court seal she recognized immediately. Ethics investigation. Sealed. Most judges would have moved on. She didn't. Pulling the thread meant digging through old archives, cross-referencing docket numbers that hadn't been touched in years. At first, the files were just dry transcripts, motions, denials, procedural delays. But then, she found it. A report, heavily redacted, from the State Bar's disciplinary committee, and even through the blacked-out sections, the bones of the scandal were clear. Jury tampering, improper contact with a witness, a transfer of funds that looked suspiciously like a bribe. It hadn't gone public. The investigation had been resolved, quietly. Officially, the records were sealed. Unofficially, she now knew something that could end Daniel Kerrigan's career. In a single afternoon, she leaned back in her chair, the glow of the desk lamp catching the faintest smile on her lips. The hunter had just become the hunted. The next morning, court resumed as if nothing had changed. Kerrigan walked in with his usual confidence, flashing that same easy grin at the jury, tapping his pen on the defense table like a man keeping time to his own rhythm. He didn't see it, didn't feel it, but Amara's gaze was different now. Not the cool, impassive stare of a judge weathering disrespect, but the eyes of someone holding a loaded weapon no one else knew existed. In the middle of a break, she stepped into her chambers and made a call. The voice on the other end was cautious. "You know I can't just hand those over, Judge. They're sealed. I'm not asking you to hand them over," she said calmly. "I'm asking you to confirm whether my understanding is correct." A pause, a sigh. Then off the record. "You've got it right. Every word." She hung up without another word. The pieces were all in place. From that moment, her strategy shifted. Every ruling, every procedural choice was made with surgical precision. She allowed his small victories, just enough to feed his arrogance. She let him feel untouchable, because when she struck, it wouldn't just be to wound. It would be to erase him. One afternoon, as the jury filed out for a recess, Kerrigan strolled past the bench, leaning in just close enough to say, "You know, Judge, once this trial's over, maybe you and I can have a talk about how to keep these big cases from getting away from you." She didn't look at him, didn't answer, but in her mind she saw the image of his face when the sealed report came to light. The moment he realized the career he'd spent decades building was over, and that thought was enough to keep her calm. What Kerrigan didn't know was that she had already begun setting the stage. A quiet conversation with a journalist she trusted, a hint dropped to a member of the State Bar who owed her a favor, a carefully timed request to unseal certain historical documents under the guise of precedent research. It was all invisible to him, and that was exactly how she wanted it, because Daniel Kerrigan was a man who believed he could see every move on the board, and Amara Lewis was about to show him. He'd been playing the wrong game all along. If the first half of the trial had been about surviving his attacks, the second half would be about dismantling him, piece by piece. The thing about power is that it's not always taken with a shout. Sometimes it's stolen with a whisper. From the outside, nothing seemed different. The trial moved forward, the witnesses came and went, and Daniel Kerrigan still carried himself like the man running the show. But inside the walls of Judge Amara Lewis's courtroom, the balance had shifted. He just didn't know it yet.
It started small. The morning after she uncovered his past, Kerrigan objected to a line of questioning, confident, clear, his voice pitched just right for the jury to hear. Sustained, she said. Then, without missing a beat, prosecution, rephrase your question. It seemed like a win for him. He even smirked, but the rephrased question was sharper, and the witness's answer cut directly against his defense. By the time he realized it, the jury was already scribbling notes. The next day, he filed a motion for evidence exclusion, a technical maneuver he'd used countless times before. She denied it, not with outrage, not with any hint of personal animosity, but with a calm, airtight citation of precedent that left him no ground to challenge it. He had to sit down. Fast. This was the rhythm she established. Let him think he'd scored a point, then pull it out from under him so precisely that the loss stung twice as much. Outside the courtroom, her moves were even quieter. One evening, she placed a call to a journalist. Not just any journalist. The same woman Kerrigan had brushed off during a press gaggle months earlier, when she'd asked about a questionable case settlement. "He's not worth my time," he'd said, loud enough for cameras to catch. The memory had stayed with her. Now, the same journalist sat across from Amara in a quiet coffee shop, listening carefully as the judge spoke in generalities. No names, no explicit accusations, just breadcrumbs. Enough to spark curiosity, enough to make the right person start digging. Her second call was to a man named Victor Rains, a former client of Kerrigan's, the kind of man you didn't forget, not because of his size or his voice, but because of the way he spoke about betrayal. Kerrigan had won Victor's case years ago, then billed him for triple the agreed amount. When Victor protested, Kerrigan threatened to countersue. Victor paid. He never forgot. Now, when Amara asked if he'd be willing to talk to someone about his experience, his answer was simple. Name the place. I'll be there. Her third move was right under Kerrigan's nose. The clerk in her courtroom, a meticulous woman named Dana, had been keeping her own quiet notes for years. Nothing malicious, just habit. But those notes included more than schedules and filing errors. They included every time Kerrigan had missed a deadline, every time he'd submitted a flawed exhibit, every time his behavior skirted the line of contempt. Now, with a subtle nod from Amara, Dana began organizing those notes. Neatly, chronologically. It was a ledger of arrogance, and it was growing. Back in the courtroom, the traps became more intricate. Kerrigan would call a witness, confident their testimony would support his defense. She'd allow it, then permit the prosecution a line of questioning that flipped the witness's statement against him. He'd object. She'd overrule, not loudly, but with the kind of precision that made the jury lean forward, as if they were watching a chess game play out one move ahead of him. The small humiliations began to add up. One afternoon, he misquoted a statute in front of the jury, a minor slip, but one she didn't let slide. "Counselor," she said, her voice measured, "you appear to be referencing the 2016 amendment. This court would remind you we're operating under the 2019 revision." She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply returned her gaze to the prosecution. But the damage was done. The jurors exchanged looks. Reporters' pens scratched faster. For Kerrigan, control was everything. And now, control was slipping through his fingers, grain by grain. He started making smaller mistakes, cutting witnesses off too soon, forgetting to lay proper foundation for exhibits, over-explaining to the jury in ways that sounded defensive. The kind of mistakes Amara highlighted, just enough for everyone to notice. Outside, the ripples from her quiet alliances began to spread. The journalist published a piece on patterns of conduct among high-profile defense attorneys. It didn't name Kerrigan, but the parallels were impossible to miss. Victor Raines gave an interview about being strong-armed by a lawyer he'd once trusted. No names again, but the description of the man's habits, his speech, his mannerisms. Well, anyone paying attention could connect the dots. And still, Kerrigan walked into court each day, believing he was just a few moves away from breaking her completely. He had no idea that the ground beneath him was already cracking. Because Judge Amara Lewis wasn't just waiting to win the case, she was preparing to end the man. And with each subtle cut, each quiet collaboration, each procedural noose she tightened around him, she was getting closer, much closer. The final day of the trial began like any other. Or at least that's how Daniel Kerrigan believed it began. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras perched like vultures waiting for the kill. Jurors filed in, stone-faced notebooks in hand. The defendant, that slick pharmaceutical CEO, sat stiff in his tailored suit, and at the bench, Judge Amara Lewis, still, composed, the picture of impartial authority. But underneath, every move, every word, every breath, was calculated. Kerrigan stood, buttoning his jacket with a flourish. "Your Honor," he began, "before we proceed to closing arguments, I have a motion." He didn't get to finish. "Denied," she said. Not loud, not hurried, just final. His jaw flexed. "With respect, Your Honor, you haven't even heard." "I don't need to." A ripple of surprise passed through the gallery. The jurors glanced at each other. Kerrigan's voice hardened. "Then I'll note my objection for the record." She didn't blink. Noted. Overruled. Proceed. He regrouped quickly. Years of courtroom dominance, teaching him to never let the cracks show for long. He launched into his closing argument, pacing the floor, gesturing just enough to project command. He spoke of doubt, of flawed witnesses, of overreach by the state. The jury listened, the cameras rolled, and then, he made the mistake. He turned toward the bench, and with that familiar smirk, the one that had punctuated weeks of disrespect, he said, "And if this court were as committed to fairness as it claims, we might not be here at all." The silence after that was different. He thought it was tension breaking in his favor. It wasn't. Judge Lewis leaned forward, folding her hands on the bench. "Mr. Kerrigan, step forward." He hesitated. The gallery shifted. Even the bailiff's eyes sharpened. Slowly, he approached. "Mr. Kerrigan," she said, her tone calm. "You've spent the duration of this trial testing the boundaries of this court. You've disrespected its orders, its process, and at times, its very integrity." He opened his mouth, but she cut him off with a look so cold it froze the words in place. "I have allowed it," she continued, "because I believe every attorney deserves the chance to zealously represent their client. But there is a line, and you crossed it. Years ago." A murmur rippled through the room. From beneath the bench, she produced a folder. Not thick, but heavy in a different way. "This morning," she said, "the court received authorization to unseal documents from the State Bar's disciplinary committee. Documents bearing your name." Gasps. Camera shutters clicked in rapid bursts. Kerrigan's face lost its color. "Your Honor, this is an official record," she interrupted, "detailing an investigation into jury tampering, witness bribery, and unethical conduct in the case of State v. Holloway. 10 years ago." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every eye in the room was on her. "You will find," she said, opening the folder, "that the committee concluded there was sufficient evidence to pursue disbarment. But before action was taken, the file was sealed."
a decision that until today kept this information from the public record. She let the words hang. The silence was deafening. Kerrigan tried to recover. "This is irrelevant. It is directly relevant," she said sharply. "To your credibility as an officer of the court." She turned her gaze to the jury. "This man has stood before you for weeks, asking you to trust his word, his judgment, his integrity. Now you know the history he has worked to keep hidden." The jury's faces shifted, curiosity giving way to disbelief, and then to something colder. Kerrigan's allies in the gallery, the ones who'd whispered and laughed during recesses, sank into their seats. One of them quietly slid his phone from his pocket, typing furiously. The defendant looked at Kerrigan, as if seeing him for the first time. "Effective immediately," Judge Lewis continued. "This court is referring the matter back to the State Bar for disciplinary action, and in light of this development, the defense's credibility before this jury is
irreparably compromised." Her gavel struck once. The motion to dismiss is denied. The defense is finished. It was over. Kerrigan's mouth opened, closed. No words came. The jury wouldn't meet his eyes. The cameras drank in every second. The bailiff stepped forward. "Counselor," he said quietly, "you'll need to come with me." Kerrigan looked around the room, searching for even one friendly face. There were none. As he was escorted out, the gallery exploded in a storm of whispers and camera flashes. The defendant slumped in his chair, the weight of a lost case settling over him. And at the bench, Judge Amara Lewis sat exactly as she had when the day began, still, composed, unshaken. She didn't look after Kerrigan as the doors closed behind him. She didn't need to, because the entire city had just watched him fall. Not in private, not in rumor, but here, in the open, in the very place he had tried to strip her authority. And now, that authority was absolute. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, Kerrigan's face was everywhere, not framed in the flattering light of a polished headshot, but frozen mid-expression, eyes wide, caught in the moment. He realized his career was collapsing. The headlines were merciless. Star defense attorney, linked to ethics scandal. Jury tampering allegations resurface in high-profile trial. Kerrigan's past finally catches up. On television, legal analysts dissected the unsealed report line by line. Old cases he'd won were now being re-examined. The whispers about his methods, once confined to back rooms and quiet corners, were now shouted in prime-time segments. At his firm, the glass door bearing his name was gone by noon. An empty pane, where bold lettering had stood for years. Inside, his office was stripped bare, files boxed, desk cleared, the walls naked. Former allies wouldn't take his calls. Old friends refused to be photographed with him. And those who had laughed alongside him in Judge Lewis's courtroom were now giving interviews about ethical accountability. Through it all, Judge Amara Lewis said nothing. She returned to her bench the following Monday, as though the trial had ended without spectacle. Same black robe, same calm posture, same unshakable tone. The courtroom felt different now, not because she had changed, but because everyone else had. The jurors who returned for post-trial formalities looked at her with a quiet respect. The attorneys who appeared before her that week spoke more carefully. Even the bailiff seemed to stand a little straighter. One evening, after the courthouse had emptied, she sat alone in her chambers. The file from the trial lay open on her desk. Not the legal record, but her personal notes, dates, times, every act of disrespect, every procedural breach, every line Kerrigan had crossed. She flipped through them slowly, page after page, until she reached the end. Then, she closed the folder, slid it into the bottom drawer of her desk, and turned the key. The faintest smile touched her lips, because justice hadn't simply been served, it had been engineered, piece by piece, quietly, deliberately. And the man who had once believed her presence on the bench was a mistake, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. Outside, the city moved on.
But in the quiet of her office, Judge Amara Lewis knew something no headline could capture. Revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper, a slow burn, the patient construction of a moment that, when it finally comes, is impossible to undo. And for her, that moment had come. So now you've seen it. Every moment, every choice, every calculated silence that led to the fall of Daniel Kerrigan. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was design. Judge Amara Lewis didn't just survive his attacks. She didn't just defend her authority. She dismantled him, piece by piece. And here's the question I can't stop thinking about, and maybe you can't either. If you were in her place, would you have waited? Would you have stayed quiet through every insult, every whisper, every public challenge to your authority, just to strike at the exact moment when the whole world was watching? Or would you have burned him the second you had the chance? Because that's the thing about revenge. It's not just what you do, it's when you do it. Amara's way was patient, cold, unflinching. But maybe your way would be different. So tell me, if the gavel was in your hand, how would you have used it? I want to hear your take. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you'd have played the long game or gone for the quick kill. And if you think more people need to see what happens when arrogance meets patience, share this story. Because the next time someone like Kerrigan thinks they can walk into a room and erase the authority of someone they don't believe belongs there, maybe they'll remember this ending. And maybe they'll think twice.